Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I'm going to be speaking about what real magic is, or at least trying to get to the heart of whether or not there is such a thing as real magic. So I'm guessing that this is going to become a little bit of a ramble, and I'm not sure that there's going to be a definitive conclusion or answer at the end of this, and so I am hoping that this is just going to offer some food for thought and start a dialogue, or at least contribute to a dialogue. I don't think that the points I'm going to be touching upon or speaking to are entirely new or unique. I think there will be many out there who can resonate with and already feel and think these things themselves, but I'm hoping that I can offer a unique perspective or lens, and maybe I do say something that you hadn't thought of, and I am looking to be inspired as well. So on any of these topics that I touch upon, I welcome dialogue, feedback, responses. So in the comments or in a video, I would love to hear what you all have to say on any of these topics that I speak to or touch upon along the way. I have some notes. I'm hoping I can stay on track to some extent. In the synthesizing of this video as an idea, one inspiration does come to mind, and that is Thorn Mooney and her channel and the content she creates and what she speaks to. There isn't a specific video that I have in mind, but I know that a lot of what I speak to she has spoken of in her own way on her channel, so I will have her channel linked down below. I highly recommend checking her out. She has a lot of very insightful, thoughtful content in regards to witchcraft, magic, and all of the things surrounding that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the inspiration in my life for what I'm going to be speaking to, and that is reading fictional novels. I have been reading a lot more of them lately than usual, but they've always been a big part of my life and my practice, and I like to incorporate fictional literature, fantastical media, pop culture, characters from movies and TV shows, along with themes and elements. So I'm always incorporating things like that into my magical practice. And for me, they are equally as valid as any sort of instructional traditional text I might pick up and decide to learn from. And I know that there are mixed views on how that is regarded within the magical community in terms of traditionalists and those who have very specific and long-held beliefs about what magic ought to be or how it is conducted and what it all entails. And of course there are different cultural backgrounds, there are different upbringings and generations and types of magic throughout the world, so that your geography and culture may also affect the way that you view magic and what real magic is for you. And so I think all of that is extremely fascinating, but my reading of fictional literature and the use of it in my practice is what's inspiring me to even contemplate what real magic might be to any given person. Now, I don't think that there is one objective answer to this. I think there are infinite subjective answers to what real magic can be. On a sort of contradictory note, I do believe that there is to some extent an objective truth that can take on infinite and a myriad of an objective truth that can take on as many subjective lenses as it needs to fit all of the people involved, any magical practitioner out there. So I'm going to be using terms like magic and magical practitioner as sort of umbrella topics and terms to hopefully include anybody who works with magic and in any sort of way, whether you identify with the title or not. I think the idea of a title in terms of real magic and how that may or add validity to your practice or detract from it is a really interesting topic as well. I think I've been of two minds throughout my magical practice, one where I have found power in a title and the idea of claiming one for myself to be very liberating in a way and affirming and validating for what it was that I was doing at a given time. And I've also been more of the mind at some points where a title felt limiting, confining, restrictive. I didn't like the way that it sat on me in some ways and I felt like it connoted. And so I can see multiple sides to those who enjoy and use titles and those who don't. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer as far as titles go, but I am interested to know what anybody out there thinks about titles and where they stand on that topic. I think I'm somewhere in the middle now. I don't mind topics. I don't mind being referred to as a witch, a magician, a magical practitioner, but I also, in some ways, tend to shy away from them in saying them so overtly, but I don't push them away. So I guess I'm a little bit in between, but topics as they pertain to real magic I find very interesting, and so I'd be curious to know what you all think. Now, drawing from fictional sources, pop culture, fantastical media, I say that in just that things that seem very detached from our consensus reality, those are areas that I think many of us draw from in our magical practice, but that these are very contemporary ways to work magically or to conduct a magical practice. And so I know that there are varying opinions on that based on traditions and those who have come before us, or the older generation, or the generation that's a little bit more established, tends to shy away from or not really see those well, I'm not speaking for everybody of that generation, of course, but I'm speaking generally just because it's what I have experienced in my comings and goings online and speaking to more mature practitioners versus younger practitioners. There tends to be a little bit of a dichotomy in what is viewed or seen or accredited in terms of magical validity. And so I think that it's a touchy topic. It can be, at least. I think it's also a very fun topic to investigate. I think asking questions, deciding that you are going to pick apart and pull at the strings of the fabric that make up any given thing is an exciting ride to be a part of. So I'm hoping that we can do that a bit. Now, part of what I want to get to at first is speaking to a history of magic, not necessarily a very literal technical history, more of an overarching broad history that touches upon concepts and prevailing themes that I think have existed for all of time, as long as magical practice in any sort has existed, whether or not it was called that or anything of the sort. So I believe that at any given point in history, even the first, I guess, traceable sources of magic were all, in some ways, trailblazers. They were groundbreaking. They were pioneers in magic out of the time. What they were doing was seen as new age. I say new age because I don't mean it in the way that we use new age now to connote a very specific type of spiritual practice. I mean new age in that what they were doing was unique and new to their time. So the first herbalists and those who would find things in the earth to heal or conduct little ceremonies and rituals, I'm sure that they faced backlash and were thought to be doing things that were not condoned, that were very new and a little bit scary or frightening, or that deviated from a tradition that was already in place. And so they had to contend with their predecessors and fighting to sort of gain a respect and validity in what they were conducting, and eventually they became the more established generation with I guess, those who came after them doing something maybe a little bit different from what they did. And so it's interesting to see that in modern times we take, for example, or there's this sort of link to using certain pop culture things as not being so valid to some. I don't think that that's necessarily everybody out there, but I do think that there is a large portion of magical practitioners who don't view those sources for magical practice as savory or valid. So I think it's interesting that we have that, but I do think that has always existed. I mean, I think of the Golden Dawn and how their idea of taking mythologies and cultures that they weren't born into, drawing from them and modernizing it for their time, so they weren't true to form for what maybe the original people or religion actually held them to be, and they kind of morphed them to their own needs. They created lodges, they used very modern tools for their time to conduct magic, and this was all seen as very credible. It was seen as a serious undertaking, something that was to be handled with care. It was definitely magic that was both revered, respected, and feared. And so they, I guess, didn't really face so much backlash or didn't have to deal with opinions surrounding what was something that was entirely of their own making. Whereas I think magical practitioners now, who will craft practices that are very unique to them or draw from pop culture or less traditional sources, do sometimes face backlash, or the harsher opinions of those who don't find those things to be right or fitting or real. I'm putting all of these terms in quotes because I'm saying them a bit sarcastically. I'm taking some creative liberties with them, but we have things like the Golden Dawn, ceremonial magic, secret societies that were doing things that weren't traditional for their time, that are now seen as traditional now that we've come 100 years or more into the future. But for their time, what they were doing was quite new, and I don't think they were facing the backlash or the harsh critique that trailblazing and pioneer type magical practitioners do today. I think that's in part due to the amount of interconnectedness that we have, the amount of visibility we all have into each other's practice and lives, and the resources we have at our disposal. So we can peek into anybody's practice or many people's practice at any given time. We can learn what so-and-so is doing and what another person's doing. We can see somebody across the globe. A younger practitioner can view an older practitioner, and likewise. And so we have a sort of, in some ways it feels a bit unhealthy, view or lens or peek into the practices of so many others. I also find this to be in some ways unhealthy, but in other ways extremely helpful, because it means that there is so much inspiration to draw from. We have more literature and information at our disposal than any time before us has had, and so that creates, I think, a mixture of views so vast that there's bound to be some dispute and dissent within any given community. And while I think that that is unfortunate in some ways and that it can be debilitating or silencing for some, I do think that dialogues that come out of more opinions being shared ultimately leads to, I think, more inclusivity. It leads to a wider diversity and range of magical practices, opinions, workings, traditions that can now take shape and go forward. It feels a lot more democratic in a way, or I guess democratic in that what is popular many flock to, and that can be a sign that there's something there, that there's a need for what that thing represents, and so that magical path or paradigm may become more popular. Does that make it any more real or less valid or more valid, or in today's terms, does that make it more of a trend, a trendy thing, or a pop culture phenomena? Perhaps. Does that mean that it shouldn't be well regarded? Does it mean that it's less than because of the quantity? It doesn't mean that there's less quality. I think that is also a very subjective thing, the quality of a practice versus the surface exterior, and that's something that I know many practitioners have spoken to in recent days. We have witch talk and Instagram, where practices have really bumped up in terms of an aesthetic, and that there is this push for a very pretty, beautiful practice that looks a certain way, and that there is this sort of implied or connoted there's a sort of implication that many practices are more fluff than they are of substance. And of course, when we think that way, we are assuming, but it's interesting to see where the truth lies, or where any subjective truth lies in terms of substance versus facade. So that's another thing that I think could use talking about in terms of real magic. And is it any less real if it is more of a facade than it is of substance? Does that make it... can it not hold a candle to a more substantial working practice just because it is more concerned with the aesthetic? Could that be its own form of magic? And I think in getting into other forms of magic that may be arising in today, not just the inspirations like literature and media, which are up for debate in terms of their validity in magic, and where I'm concerned, I think that they are just as valid, but they are kind of on the chopping block at times. Not just the inspirations, but the actual practice itself, and what sort of actions and practices can be construed as magical in nature. I love in modern times how many speak to the idea of magic and a magical practice being whatever it is that one chooses to make it, that almost like the validity and the realness of something is in the eye of the beholder, and that's where we see those subjective truths shining bright. Things like journaling and writing being seen as valid and very substantial forms of magic, and that's something that I take part in as well, and I think that's beautiful. I think that in choosing to see anything that somebody does as magic, if they choose to see it that way themselves, I think that we allow ourselves to live more holistically magical lifestyles that aren't just relegated to an altar. I think that in modern days, magic has become more expansive in terms of the actions that we take, in the way that we can incorporate magic into our lifestyles because of the way that magic is viewed and how it has sort of transformed. It doesn't have this formal element. It doesn't always need to be necessarily medicinal or well thought out or so focused and done in private. It can be done out in the open. It can be vibrant. It can be in the form of artwork. It can be done through writing that others then take upon themselves to read and reap the benefits from magically in some way. Color can be magic. And I think another great form of magic that many of us and many who are watching this may tap into is divination. And that's something that I struggled with at the start. I used to view and separate the ideas of divination from magic. And I think in recent, I would say years, maybe even months, I have really found a power for myself in viewing any sort of divination I conduct to be of a magical nature, that I'm conducting magic of some sort. Maybe it's high magic and I'm touching upon myself in a higher sense. Maybe I am conducting magic that is meant to give me insight into the world around me. Maybe I'm conducting magic that is meant to change myself to fit something that I want or to manifest something through the cards. And all of that is possible, and I think all of that is valid magic in its own right. I think what we get into is what other opinions are. So we have things to sort of grapple with, like gatekeeping and popular opinion and the voices that we may run into online and in real life as social practitioners of any sort. And I think it's very difficult to entirely escape outside influence and voice. I think even when one turns to literature and books of an instructional, traditional sort, you are still kind of contending with the voice of the author. And so you're not necessarily practicing in solitude. You are using the voice and interacting in a sort of one-way communication sort of thing with another practitioner of some sort. They are imparting knowledge onto you, and so you are receiving some form of communication, so you're not entirely in isolation in that way. We have the online sphere, of course, whether you create content or just observe, or if you comment, if you share words or pictures or videos, you are in some way a social practitioner. And I think that that lends itself to gatekeeping and opinions that we need to at least address. We don't necessarily need to agree. We don't need to value all of the opinions and advice that come our way, but I think it's important to understand them and to take the time to learn from them. So we have, of course, gatekeepers, those who like to take a certain tradition or practice that they are a part of and almost try to do what they can to exclude others from partaking for one reason or another. Maybe they don't like the individual, maybe they don't like the way that they go about the thing that they are doing themselves, and they don't like the new ideas. Maybe they were somebody who was a founder or a very mature and long-term member of a certain tradition, and they feel the need to uphold it, and their way of upholding it is to be very selective and exclusive in those who join. So I personally am not a fan of gatekeeping. I know many of us aren't, but it does exist and it does prevail through into modern day. Another interesting term and form of practice that I think is separate from gatekeeping, of course, but I've seen mentioned in tandem with, is the idea or closed practices that exist. And I think closed practices, in my personal opinion, are valid in that there are marginalized groups and cultures who have had their traditions and practices almost drawn from and taken from in such a way, and they've been degraded by oppressors in some way, and so they need to close off their practice. There are also paths, cultures, traditions that are intrinsically passed down through lineage or through cultural background, and that one outside of such things cannot partake in, just because that is exactly what the practice or cultural the cultural sort of paradigm exists within, is that idea. And so I think the need and the necessity for for closed practices is very valid and that exists. I don't think it should be mentioned in connection with gatekeeping. I don't think the two are interchangeable in any sort of way. I think they are nuanced and they come from different places. Their intentions, at least, and what they represent are very different, in my opinion. But I'd be curious to know what others feel about gatekeeping, how and what experience you have in terms of seeing it or experiencing it yourself. And if you are a member within a closed practice of some sort, how you view that to be if you're on the outside of a practice or you aren't in a closed practice, how you view closed practices that you may have seen from afar, or friends that you might have who are a part of closed practices and how that works. I'm very curious about those sorts of things, and I've been trying to do my research into some closed practices just to understand them better so that I don't step on any toes potentially. But all of that I find to be extremely interesting as well. Now, a big part for me about real magic that gets into real magic is that for me, I think there is, well, I think that this is something many can resonate with, that there is a sort of core that we can reach where all magical practices and forms of magic draw from. So if we were to distill any tradition, any paradigm, any practice to its base elements, we would probably see that they all look pretty much the same. The idea of exerting will to create change, for self-discovery, self-enlightenment, to get in touch with the self, better understanding, universal gnosis. All these sorts of things exist within almost all forms of spirituality, magical practice. These elements prevail. And so I think in trying to get to the heart of what real magic is and in understanding others and finding common ground where we don't necessarily need to fight or vie for dominance in terms of what is more real or better, I think that we might benefit from looking to the base elements. I mean, we put masks and words and faces to a lot of what we do to make it more digestible, to make it seem a lot less abstract and broad and confusing. If we were to strip back the idea of all of these names of goddesses and all of these practices that have very minute and nuanced steps to them, I think we would really see that the idea of exerting one's will to create change or to understand oneself and the universe around us, all of these are part of most magical practices. And so to understand that is, I think, a power. It is a way to be able to interact with, understand, and collaborate with fellow magical practitioners who may be very different from your own, who may hold fundamentally different beliefs in terms of what magic is or ought to be. But I don't think that necessarily means that the two people are incompatible or can't be friends or can't draw inspiration from one another. I am a big proponent for dialogue, debate, trying to understand opinions that oppose your own or that don't sit so well with your own. That doesn't mean you need to agree, doesn't mean you need to change your mind, but I do think that there's a power in understanding multiple perspectives and sides, and I think that to close one's ears off and choose not to listen to something just because you don't like the way it sounds or because it may be harmful or something like that is a shame. I think that if you want to combat the harm that any sort of malicious opinion holds, the best way to do so is to understand it before acting against it, because how can you properly assess or remedy or take action against an opinion you don't like if you don't understand what it is? It's like trying to find a cure for a toxin and you don't quite understand what the toxin is. Well, then you're not going to have much of a chance of curing it. So I think hearing people out on what they have to say, sometimes you might be pleasantly surprised and find that you are shifting your views a little bit, that there's some validity to what they said that you maybe didn't grasp hold of so much, maybe taking the time to listen and not just gearing up for a rebuttal or to speak. I think many times when we say that we are allowing or listening to somebody, we're really just hearing them and we're already mentally preparing to have some sort of comeback to refute what they've said instead of actually listening and ingesting what they've said, taking the time to let it percolate and fully get our grasp on it and then to offer a response. I think a lot of times we are quite reactionary to what others say when we don't agree, or when we have a different viewpoint, we're more reactionary than we are responsive. I think when you take the time to let something sit and you don't necessarily raise your hackles and allow those triggers and harsh and very forward placed emotions to come through, when you allow them to just simmer, die down a little bit, and then respond from a place of understanding, I think you put yourself in a better position of, I think, just deeper understanding about in terms of yourself and others. And so that's, I think, a big part of coming to terms for yourself about what real magic is getting out there and seeing what others are doing and what they believe and why they believe it. I think if you want to understand what real magic is in any sort of way, in your own subjective way, that it's important to look to practices and opinions that differ from your own, and taking the time to truly listen. Likewise, getting back to that idea of there being this one almost objective truth that if we were to distill all of the religions, all of the spiritual paths, paradigms, practices to their base elements, that they would look so similar. There's so many prevailing themes that if we were to strip back all of the facade or all of the outer layer that makes up a practice, we would see that its core, its heart, looks very much the same as any other heart of any other practice or religion. And to see how throughout human history there has been so much dissent, so much violence, so much corruption and dispute due to religions that didn't agree, the need to exert or proselytize one's religion to others through crusades, through murder because what somebody else was doing didn't seem right. I think all of that is very fear-based. I think that it's a need for control. It's a need to see validity in what you believe personally, and to almost exert your power, your force, your control on another to affirm or reaffirm some insecurity that you have in your own belief system or practice. I say you, I'm not speaking to anybody necessarily watching this, and if I am, I'm speaking to myself as well, so do keep that in mind. But kind of in a circuitous ramble, circling back to where we started, is there a real form of magic? Is there such thing as real magic? What does that look like? Are you a results-oriented type of practitioner? Do you look to see change in the world around you? Do you look to see that a working you've done has a very literal effect that is outside of yourself? Is the effect that you look for more internal? Does it matter? Are you more concerned with why a thing works than whether it works? Are you more of the psychological mindset where maybe you don't believe in energy or power or magic that can actually spur on change that is disembodied from you? Or do you believe that it is more of a psychological process? Do you think maybe you're interacting with your unconscious mind or kind of toying with the idea of consciousness? And is that any different from exuding very objective will on items and the world around you or another human being? All of those types of viewpoints and how magic might work and why and how that factors into one's practice, those are also important points, I think, in terms of what makes magic real for any given person. And is there one truth? Is there one type of magic? Is there one very singular way that magic can work? Is the magic that is more of the mind also a form of magic? Is there actually a disembodied sort of energetic magic that can do things to the world? I think maybe in between or of both camps. I hope for both. I maybe try for both in my own magical practice, and I don't necessarily feel like I sit in one of those camps so firmly. I think as far as practices go that I draw from, backgrounds, very literal ways that I go about working magic, my belief systems, I think are all very fluid. I like that. I like that from one day to the next I can feel different or believe something maybe a bit different, that I'm open to the views of others. For me, that feels right. It feels I'm not necessarily yearning to find a place to plant my roots in terms of magic and beliefs. I think I may wander for my entire life and feel very comfortable being sort of fluid in my beliefs and practices. And I'm curious to know if there are those of you out there who feel the same, if any of you feel a sense of power and belonging in maybe sitting firmly in a set of beliefs or practices, and how that affects what you see to be as real magic in your life or the world around you. So I know that this was quite the ramble, and I hope it wasn't too incoherent. I hope that there was something inspiring, something that you can take from all of this, and I am looking to learn from all of you. So please comment or respond and let me know your thoughts on real magic, or if there are topics in regards to real magic that you think are super important to talk about that I didn't touch upon. Let me know. If this was fun or entertaining, please subscribe and like the video. I hope you are all well, and until next time, bye.